Well, blessings and greetings to each of you today. I hope all is well in your world. Again, thanks for being here for today's message. Today I want to bring a message out of the book of Ecclesiastes, and I've titled it, That Life is a Paradox. So I go to the dictionary and I get a definition of paradox, and it says this: things which appear to contradict itself, but may really be true. See, I think that life is a paradox, and I think that life is pretty complicated. Why is it that we say things like that money and material things and possessions that we accumulate, they really aren't the important things in our lives, and yet we spend almost all of our time and all of our energies accumulating these things? George Bernard Shaw said, "The universal regard for money is the one hopeful fact in our civilization, the one sound spot in our social conscience. Money is the most important thing in the world." So, and to paraphrase him, he says that if you've got money, well, you can take care of your needs. And if you don't have money, well, then you're in trouble. And here's a quote of his. Again, speaking of money. "Not the least of its virtues is that it destroys base people as certainly as it fortifies and dignifies noble people." Well, of course, if we've learned anything about kingdom stuff, but we were offended by these words, aren't we? Especially that money is the most important thing in the world. You know, as Christians, we're going to have to be vigilant against such temptation in our own lives, and I tell you, this may be harder than we might suspect. French sociologist Jacques Ellul, he said this: "As the Christian gospel spreads through society, it tends to produce values paradoxically contradicting the gospel." And so historically it says it works like this. First, we've got this highly committed Christian community. And they begin with this sense of devotion. And then secondly, this devotion produces a life of discipline. And then thirdly, this discipline expresses itself in hard work and learning. And then fourth, these practices, this hard work and learning, well, it produces abundance. And then finally, the abundance, it breaks down the discipline and it leads to decadence. In other words, he's saying that God blesses us, and then because of these blessings, we find that we really don't need God anymore, and it leads to our falling away from Him or turning from our God. And the Old Testament bears witness to entire nations with this kind of a problem. I mean, ancient Israel, it spent less time on spiritual matters and more time on power and alliances. And our people devoted themselves to luxury, and they left God. I mean, the book of Judges gives example after example after example of this happening. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we immune from this temptation? Do we understand why Jesus warns against wealth? And he called the poor and the persecuted the ones that were blessed. Well, somehow Christians are going to have to figure this kind of stuff out. And not just what we do with our blessings, but what's the ultimate purpose of our being here? You know, why are we living? You know, what's this circus that we live in all about? Can you or I, one person out of I don't know how many billion are on the face of the earth anymore, can we make a difference about anything? Well, again, I read a lot of Yancey materials, and he's got a book dealing with existentialism. And this was a subject that was really big back in the 60s when I was in graduate school. We discussed existentialism a lot. And of course, the thought's nothing new. I mean, the book of Job is filled with this kind of thinking. But I want to read a paragraph out of Yancey's book to kind of set the thought and maybe give us a description of existentialism. It says, "It makes little difference whether one dies at age 30 or 70, since in either case other men and women will continue living. The world will go on as before. What difference does really anything make?" It matters little whether you get out of bed or stay in bed, whether you love life or hate it, stab yourself in the hand or just wander from one bar to another picking fights. Life goes on whether you strive to change it or merely succumb to it. What is a human being but a tiny blip in the billion-year progress of history? G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "All men matter. You matter. I matter." And it's the hardest thing in theology to believe. You know, these thinkers about, what's the point of it all? Ironically, they can go to the Bible to get encouragement in this kind of thinking. The book of Ecclesiastes basically says the same thing. The author, he seems to be an existentialist. The very first sentence of the book, he talks about the conclusion of life. It says, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And that's the key word. This word meaningless, it appears 35 times, drumming home the theme from beginning to end. And did you know that there's only one other book in the Bible where that word is found? And not surprising, it's the book of Job. And we think like Job, and we think like the author of Ecclesiastes. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, evil people prosper, good people suffer, tyrants reign, disaster happens. Everybody dies and turns to dust. Life is unfair. See, nothing makes sense. The whole world seems to be off balance and twisted. And so you might as well eat, drink, and be merry because there's no point in living. You work hard, somebody else gets the credit. You accumulate money, spoiled heirs end up with it. You struggle to do good and bad people trample on you. And besides, everybody, rich or poor, good or bad, they meet the same end. We all die. Now, it's been noted that death contradicts the notion that we were born to be happy. And so there's only one word to describe life: meaningless. See, it's one thing to, sit around in a college class with a bunch of guys who think they're sharp, or read Camus or Sartre, these modern day psychologists. But this is from the Bible. I wonder if modern existentialists appreciate the irony of Ecclesiastes 1, 9, and 10. It says, there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing of which we could say, look, here's something new. All these guys, sitting around and debating over all these issues, and the conclusion is there's nothing new here. Now, another interesting thing, how can two books in the Bible right after each other, how can they coexist when they seem totally opposite? You really wonder if Ecclesiastes is kind of a mocking rebuttal to Proverbs. See, Proverbs, it's got life figured out. Learn wisdom, follow the rules, and you'll live a long, prosperous life. It's filled with optimism. It's like the writer saying, I've got life figured out, and you need to follow my advice. Listen to the words of Proverbs. This is good advice. We quote it all the time, don't we? And then the very next book reminds us that thrifty, honorable people, they die like everybody else. For a glimpse of the vast difference between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, simply compare the use of the word wisdom. See, Proverbs exalts and personifies wisdom. We learn later, in James, pray for wisdom and God will give it to you abundantly. And yet Ecclesiastes 1:18 says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. And then the teacher says, wisdom's got some advantages over folly, but so what? The same fate overtakes them both. For who knows what is good for a man in life during the few days and meaningless days he passes through life like a shadow? In Yancey's book, he brings out the fact that most biblical scholars, they doubt that Solomon actually wrote Ecclesiastes. It's kind of like the book of Hebrews. The author is not mentioned really anywhere. However, this author or Solomon, whoever, they lived in the best of times. Israel was at its zenith. Israel was rich, it was powerful, it was at peace. The days of Egyptian slavery, they were just a mere memory from the past. So why would he despair and be so negative about life when things were so good? But whenever you think about it, it seems you have more despair coming out of what seems to be success. Walker Percy wrote a book called The Message in a Bottle. And he asked questions like, why do more people commit suicide in San Francisco, the most beautiful city in America? In Europe, the suicide capital is Salisbury, Austria, another beautiful place to live. Why do people with good jobs and loving families and recreational time often feel sad and they don't know why? Well, Percy goes on to explain that despair arises out of circumstances of plenty rather than deprivation. And he explains that existential despair, it didn't germinate in the hellholes of Auschwitz or Siberia, but rather in the cafes of Paris and the coffee shops of Copenhagen and the luxury palaces of Beverly Hills. And so, paradoxically speaking, a book like Ecclesiastes will arise more likely from the Golden Age. I mean, just consider the contrast between the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. I mean, they cover the same things. Life's unfair. Why does suffering exist? Why do evil people prosper and good people suffer? But they've got a difference in tone. While Ecclesiastes says things are meaningless or futile, Job, I mean, it rings with betrayal and passion and a cry for justice. I mean, Job, he shakes his fist at God and he wants a reply. The author of Ecclesiastes, he just kind of shrugs his shoulders and mumbles, yeah, so what? Reaches for another goblet of wine. But really, it describes our world and our culture. And consider those that we know or we know about, the ones that got the fancy cars and eat in the fancy restaurants and pursue the good life and have sexual encounters with many, and recreational drugs are part of their life. They're the gusto grabbers that we know about. I mean, they're not wicked people. They just demonstrate no interest in God and no passion for morality. I mean, they're all around us. Such people like this, they outraged Job. He says they spend their years in prosperity. They go down to the grave in peace. They say to God, leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? But then you get a contrast from Job to Ecclesiastes. See, Ecclesiastes, it neither curses or blesses God, but only finds him incomprehensible. We can't figure him out, so why try? See, unlike Job, the author of Psalms, it appears that the writer of Ecclesiastes, he doesn't have a passionate relationship with God. He slipped into idolatry, not the kind of idol worship, but the kind that kind of is spread through our culture, where 5% of Europe worships on the Lord's Day. 17 to 22% of our nation is worshiping on the Lord's Day. Because, see, we're pursuing the quality of life. But again, we're reminded we're never going to succeed. You're always going to want more. And he writes in Ecclesiastes 7, in this meaningless time of mine, I've seen both of these, a righteous man perishing in his righteousness, and a wicked man living long in his wickedness. Do not be over righteous, neither be over wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over wicked. Do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. He's saying, be good, but don't be too good. Be wise, don't be too wise. It's like tasting both extremes. And the teacher here, he settles somewhere between, hedonism and suicide, it looks like. And so we realize that if we start chasing pleasure as an end in itself, along the way, we're going to lose sight of the one who gave such good gifts to us. Gifts like sexual drive and taste buds and the capacity to appreciate beauty. And the wholesale devotion to pleasure, well, paradoxically, again, there's that word again, huh? It will lead to a state of utter despair where, nudity turns into pornography, wine into alcoholism, food into gluttony, human diversity into racism and prejudice. Okay, how do we conclude a sermon like this on life being a paradox? So I think we have to go back to G.K. Chesterton's comments that all men matter. I matter. You matter. We all matter. There is indeed a reason why man exists. Gandhi said everything that we do in life is insignificant, but we need to do it. King Solomon, or whoever the author of Ecclesiastes was, who had come out of this golden era of Israel, see, he was followed by another king, the King of Kings. See, Christ didn't teach us that success comes from accumulation, but rather it comes from self-sacrifice. So if you want to find joy in your life and purpose, you've got to give it away. Those who will come after me, Christ says, they must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. But note the writer of Ecclesiastes, he ends up saying, it's kind of like rhetorical thinking. You wonder all you want, you debate all you want, and then you already know the answer. He says, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. See, it's like he finally sees the light. It's like he wises up after all the debate and all the discussion. So what do we say to the modern day existentialist who kind of just shrugs their shoulders and they really don't care? Well, perhaps our line should be the same one as Blaise Pascal. He told his contemporaries, if I believe in God and life after death, and you do not, and there is no God, we both lose when we die. However, if there is a God, you still lose and I gain everything. One more quote and we'll wrap it up. And this one comes from Dag Hammarskjöld, whoever he was. He says, I don't know who or what put the question, and I don't know when it was put, and I don't even remember answering. But at some moment I did answer yes to someone or something, and from that hour I was certain that existence is meaningful, and that therefore my life in self-surrender had a goal. Our goal is to say yes to Jesus Christ, the author and finisher of our salvation. We can go through life and speculate on all this stuff and wonder all these things, but he is the answer. He is the main thing. Find him, put your faith in him, stay loyal to him, and everything is okay. God bless.